This is Boom Bust, and these are some of the stories that we're tracking for you today. First up, economies across the Eurozone released May manufacturing numbers on Monday, and they weren't that great. Now, we look at the numbers and what the ECB plans to do about them. Then policy expert Dr. Pippa Malmgren is on the program. Pippa is president of the Canonberry Group and co-founder of Principales Asset Management. She sat down with me earlier today to talk about the U.S. economy, social unrest, and deflationary concerns in the Eurozone. It's pretty exciting and scary stuff. And in today's big deal, Edward Harrison and I are gearing up for a sports-heavy summer. We got World Cup coming up. It's pretty bonkers, some of the stories we're covering in that segment. And it all starts right now. Our lead story today, the Eurozone. Manufacturing in the Eurozone slowed to a 6-month low in the month of May. In fact, output growth in all nations slowed with the exception of the Netherlands. 52.2% of respondents to Market's Eurozone manufacturing PMI reported growth in purchases, down from 53.4% in April. Italy's PMI fell to a 2-month low of 53.2. France's PMI fell to a 4-month low. Austria's hit a 10-month low. And Greece's PMI fell to a 2-month low of 51.0. Now, meanwhile, Spain's PMI climbed to a 49-month high of 52.9, but still missed expectations. Figures above 50 indicate expansion, so these numbers are obviously very close to that threshold. Now, the figures have fueled expectations that when the European Central Bank meets on Thursday, they will act to boost growth. Many analysts believe that the central bank could cut its deposit rates to below zero and reduce its primary borrowing rate as well. Now, despite the more somber numbers from the Eurozone, manufacturing activity in Britain increased for a 15th straight month in May. That's a 15th straight month, quite some time. Now, according to the same market survey, growth there was supported by strong domestic and overseas demand, and broad-based expansion reflected, quote, strong economic conditions as small, medium, and large enterprises all hired more staff. Now, senior economist at Market Rob Dobson said, quote, the upturn remains broad-based by sector and is being enjoyed by SMEs and large-scale producers alike. A strong domestic market is being supplemented by one of the best growth phases for new export orders in the survey's history. The benefits of the manufacturing upswing are also being shared with the wider economy through solid job creation. Germany, however, is the big red flag in all of this. Germany's PMI fell to a 7-month low of 52.3. And some analysts believe that the slowing pace of expansion in that country could possibly be linked to concerns over the situation in Ukraine. Now, overall, while the German economy is doing fine, it's now seeing outright deflation in several regions, with prices falling on a sequential basis. The Eurozone inflation rate is currently 0.7%, well below the ECB's target of 2%. ECB President Mario Draghi hinted last month that the bank's policymakers could act soon to try to counter deflationary fears. The euro took a tumble Monday morning, as again, this only puts more pressure on the ECB to ease policy this week. So, will they? We'll have to wait till Thursday to find out. As I just mentioned, Europe is not looking so great, and we're waiting with bated breath to see what the ECB will do about it. Now, to help us understand the challenges currently facing the Eurozone, we spoke with Dr. Pippa Malmgren, a politics and policy expert and founding president of Principales Asset Management. Now, Dr. Malmgren helps fund managers better understand how politics, policy, and geopolitics impact financial markets. I first asked her if deflation should be a concern for European policymakers. Take a look at what she had to say.
Well, it clearly is a concern, and that's why the ECB, Mario Draghi, is talking about potentially adding more liquidity, some kind of a new quantitative easing program, which they think will kick off next month. And they're saying, but don't have your expectations too high. They're already trying to manage the market's expectations on that one. But the thing I find really interesting in the context of Europe, and particularly the Eurozone, is the split, the widening divide, as inflation begins to pick up a little bit in Germany and deflation continues to accelerate in Spain. So the divide between the two sides is getting wider. That's going to make it much harder for the ECB, because the one country that does have cash, Germany, they're going to get increasingly uncomfortable with more liquidity being added, and the Spanish are going to say, hey, these liquidity additions are very nice, but they're not enough. We need to do more. And in fact, Spain has recently announced their intention to do a stimulus program themselves. So this divide between the two extremes in Europe is going to be harder and harder to manage. And we already see signs that countries are saying, this is getting a bit difficult for us. So the British, you know, we have this talk about a so-called Brexit, of Britain exiting the EU. We already have a lot of talk about, of the East European countries, which ones are going to join, which ones are going to join the Eurozone, which ones are now actually going to say, maybe we'll go the other direction and join with Russia. There are a lot of open questions about this. So the geopolitics within Europe also make it a little trickier for the ECB. So I guess the bottom line is, yes, there is still deflation in Europe, but we're going to get a policy response. And personally, I think investors are going to deploy capital behind European assets on an ECB announcement. It may be not a lot, but it's going to be something.
Now, you just mentioned Spain, and we know that Spain is cutting its taxes and adding stimulus to bolster a budding recovery. But what would you recommend for Eurozone countries like Spain, both on the monetary and the fiscal side?
Oh, gosh. Well, I guess, you know, my main thought would be Spain, Italy, Greece. They're all counting on Germany writing a check one way or another. They're counting on Germany loosening up on their resistance to monetary policy, which looks like it's going to work. They're counting on Germany agreeing to the issuance of bonds that are euro-wide so that they could get bailed out through that mechanism. But I don't know. I've got my doubts about whether Germany has an unlimited willingness to underwrite the losses that exist across the rest of the Eurozone. So bottom line is, they're going to have to face the pain. It's very politically difficult, but they are doing it. And I have to say, Spain in particular has shown there are many companies that have really rationalized, tightened the belt, you know, reconfigured the business model, and they are among the most competitive companies now in the world. If they can survive this, they can survive anything. But are there enough companies doing that and enough individuals doing it? That I'm not so sure. The brain drain out of Southern Europe into the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia is massive. You know, even the French are moving to the UK in very large numbers because it's the first point of economic freedom that you can get to. So I think Europe still has some very fundamental problems with the talent leaving and those who are left maybe not innovating and changing fast enough. But, you know, they'll get there eventually. If there's enough pain, there will be change.
Pippa, do you think the buoyant showing by populist and nationalist parties in recent European elections, it's due to the poor economic conditions there, or are there other factors also at play?
Yeah, I think, look, the rise of the separatist movements and right-wing, but also all opposition groups across Europe is a very, very important development. It comes back to this question of, will Germany bail out everybody else? You know, Germany's precondition is that every nation should hand over more of its fiscal sovereignty to Brussels. Every country in Western Europe, the voters are showing they do not want to do that. They are voting for parties and individuals and ideologies that absolutely oppose handing over fiscal sovereignty to the center. So this is a tough spot for the Eurozone leadership. If they think the only way to get a bailout is to get more devolution of sovereignty, and yet that's the one thing the public is voting against, then we've got a problem. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is, I think we're seeing a rise in separatist movements globally. This is a function, again, of people feeling the pain of the deflation, now in many places a rising cost of living. You put the two together, you squeeze these human beings, and they go, hang on, Why are we organized the way we are? So there's been news, for example, recently about, California again, let's, separate from the United States or split into two Californias, or, Texas is doing the same thing. Now, it's not actually going to go anywhere, but the point is people are exploring this possibility. And that's what we see behind the devolution movement in Scotland, the discussion about maybe the UK leaving the EU. It's the thing behind the events in Ukraine and now other parts of Eastern Europe, where there's discussion of, hey, do we really want to belong to the current construct, or do we want something different? That's the story in Moldova. It's also the case Thailand, right, where we see a lot of social unrest, a lot of discussion about the country maybe splitting apart, into two different groups. I think it's an absolutely normal, natural outcome of when there isn't enough money to meet everybody's needs, people feeling pain, and they go, wait a minute, maybe there's a different way of organizing ourselves. Some of these things will actually result in new configurations, and a lot of them will result in hot air. But it's an important trend.
That was Dr. Pippa Malmgren, president of the Canonberry Group and co-founder of Principales Asset Management. Time now for a very quick break, but stick around because when we return, the man behind the widely read economics blog, Economist's View, well, there you have it, Mark Thoma, he's on the program, and he's weighing in on the drama surrounding Thomas Piketty's book of the moment, Capital in the 21st Century, and he's giving us his views on where exactly the U.S. economy is headed. And then in today's big deal, Edward Harrison and I are talking sports shenanigans. A financier, a gambler, and a golfer all walk into a bar. How's the joke end? Well, you got to stay tuned to find out on today's big deal. But before we go, here are a look at some of your closing numbers at the bell. Stick around.
Are you like me? You want your comedy news with some teeth? Want your comedy news to be a bare-fisted, no-holds-barred fight to the death? Like a truth vampire biting into the necks of the corporate elite and the billionaire freaks while they're going, make it stop! Well, that's what you get with my new show, Redacted Tonight.
Was that too much? I think that was too much.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
Welcome back to the show. Now, book of the moment, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, has been a continued source of controversy. Chris Giles of the Financial Times took a close look at the data and assumptions made by Piketty, and he argues that two of the book's central findings are no longer true. The first being that wealth inequality has begun to rise over the past 30 years, and the second that the U.S. obviously has a more unequal distribution of wealth than Europe. Well, Giles' claims, of course, triggered a new round of discussions regarding the validity of Piketty's data and his conclusion. Now, we wanted to get noted economic blogger Mark Thoma's take on the matter. Thoma is a professor of economics at the University of Oregon, and he pens the widely read blog Economist's Views. Now, I first asked him where he thinks the U.S. economy is heading in the future. Take a look at what he had to say.
I think we're headed for a slow recovery, and so far, boy, it's been pretty steady. What I'm waiting for is to see what the policy reactions will be to any gyrations in the recovery, whether it recovers faster than we think or slower than we think. But right now, it just looks like we're on the same path we've been on, which is a very slow, trotting, but certain recovery. I'd like to see it faster. It's been frustrating about how slow it is, but it's hard to see that changing at this point.
Mark, now I want to ask you about the book of the moment right now. What do you make of Thomas Piketty's book on income inequality in terms of both how to frame the discussion and the right policy prescription that emanates from that?
I think it's done a very good job of bringing the whole discussion about inequality to the forefront. It's something that economists have ignored for quite a while, partly because it was what we call normative. It involves opinion on what should be rather than what is, which is more scientific. And so the discussions about inequality have really been shoved to the background within the economics profession, and we've been afraid to address those questions. So the good thing about this book is it's really bringing that debate to the forefront, and I think we'll see a lot more discussion in Washington and elsewhere about how we can handle this problem, whether it be through better education, taxes, wealth taxes, that sort of thing. I think where the book falls a bit short, and this is a comment I'm not the first to make for sure, is in its policy prescriptions. I just don't know how powerful and how well a wealth tax would work. Even getting such a tax in place with a poor measurement we have of people's wealth would be very difficult. Nevertheless, I think it's brought to the forefront the discussion of how we can address this from a policy perspective and how we can address it theoretically within the economics profession.
Now, I obviously have to go with this as a follow-up. What do you make of the recent FT article which claims that some of Piketty's math was off and that the data was used, that he used rather, was cherry-picked to prove his thesis? What do you think of that?
I think that's a bit of an overstatement about what happened. I think there's some questions you can draw about the assumptions that he's made. I don't think the data was manipulated in any way, shape, or form. I think he did the best he could to construct an incredible data set. And of course, there are going to be questions, and with a project that monumental, of course, there's going to be mistakes along the way. The fact that Britain turned around but all the other countries didn't, and even Britain, the data there doesn't look for sure that the FT is right, that rather than having an increase in inequality rate lately, it's been flat. The only real country that's been overturned is Britain, and all the countries that he looked at, that does not overturn his main thesis. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of questions to answer in terms of the assumptions that he's made in constructing his data and the particulars about Britain.
Now, you also wrote a piece on how economists figure out how the world really works. And this is a complex topic, but can you give me the elevator pitch version of your thesis on how economists use econometrics to make economics work?
Yeah, the big question there is, why is econometrics different from statistics? And in statistics, you can do laboratory experiments, and you can do them thousands and thousands of times. With an economy, it only runs once, and you have one data set. You can't go in the laboratory, hold all these other effects equal, and just look at the relationship between X and Y with Z and W and all this other stuff held constant. So econometrics is stuck with historical data, and that brings all sorts of problems. So I was trying to highlight some of the problems that exist when you use these historical data sets. For instance, the Piketty problem. This wouldn't be a big problem if we could rerun the economy 10,000 times. We have one data set with some errors in it. We've got all these other 9,999 data sets that maybe have different errors that will cancel out. When we look at those 10,000 different sets of data, we can get the right answer. When we have just one set of data, a big error can make a huge difference. And so we have to be very careful in the way we treat our data and the way we put our controls in and use these fancy econometric techniques to try to extract the truth from historical data. That means that progress in macroeconomics is going to be slow. We often have to wait for big events like a Great Recession to test our theories because we know what the data says. We know what happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years. If you build a theory to explain that, of course it's going to fit. You can't test that against the data. You have to wait for new data to come in, things you didn't anticipate. Then you can test your theories. And that's a much, much slower process than, say, a chemist who can, combine the same two chemicals over and over again and see what the reaction is, and then take the average response of all those different experiments. So as we try to highlight all the difficulties economists have working with data, and that's something we've seen with Reinhardt and Rogoff and with Piketty recently. It's just some of these things coming to the forefront.
Yep. Now, Mark, if you were running things and could conduct policy, what are the first things you do on the fiscal policy side?
I would start doing infrastructure. We've got low interest rates, we've got unemployed people, we've got huge infrastructure needs. All those things point to the notion that we need to start doing infrastructure building just as fast as we possibly can. And so I think one of the big mistakes we made is not putting a program like that in place. If I could go back and rerun the policy prescriptions during the Great Recession, I would also do a lot more to help homeowners who were struggling with balance sheet problems due to declines in stock market values, and particularly declines in equities and underwater mortgages and all those sorts of things. That really hurt the consumption, the demand for consumer durables and that sort of thing, and that really hurt our ability to recover. So those are the two biggest mistakes that I think we made on the fiscal side. Not enough infrastructure spending and not enough help for homeowners during the Great Recession.
Now, same question, but now on the monetary policy side for the next 2 to 3 years. What would you do there?
I think I would, A, be more willing to adjust the size of the taper due to variations in the economy. One thing I'm curious to see is if the Fed, if the economy slows down, how much they're willing to adjust the taper. So I'd first be willing to adjust the tapering with changes in the economy, perhaps more than the Fed will be willing to do. I would also, they seem to be in a hurry to reverse their policies. I don't think they need to be in a hurry. I don't think inflation is going to be a problem. We've got this new tool, interest on reserves. It will help freeze all the reserves of the banking system, prevent inflation if we need to. And so I would simply not be impatient. I think that's the main thing I would stress is the Fed. They've been behind the curve all the way up to this point. They just haven't reacted fast enough during the Great Recession. Now I don't want them to react too fast when we get on the other side of this thing. So patience, patience, patience would be the main thing I would say to the Fed.
That was economist Mark Thoma, author of the blog The Economist's View. Time now for today's Big Deal. Time with the wonderful Mr. Edward Harrison. Now, today we're talking about sports shenanigans and how they play out in the wide world of sports. Now, depending on who you talk to, insider trading on Wall Street is par for the course. Pun intended. But what about on the golf links? Now, they don't count strokes instead of stocks, do they? Well, perhaps not Mr. Phil Mickelson. I don't know what he counts, but he's under investigation for a deal that happened back in the summer of 2011. Now, Mickelson and golf course owner / gambler William T. Walters made several $1 million betting on 2 stocks, one of them being Clorox. They bought options contracts to buy Clorox stocks right before Carl Icahn announced an unsolicited takeover bid that drove up the stock price. Now, Icahn, Walters, and Mickelson have not been accused of any wrongdoing yet, but it brings up the issue of what exactly insider trading is and the difficulties in prosecuting it. Now, Ed, first and foremost, can you tell me a little bit about insider trading and what would Phil Mickelson need to do in order to pull off an insider trade back in 2011?
Well, you know, under the SEC Rule 10b-5, I think we can pull up what that is.
There it is.
That's where you can figure out whether or not someone's an insider. And basically, it's about conveying information as an insider to someone else who's not on the inside. That you have a fiduciary duty as an insider, and you're giving non-public information on. And now the interesting bit is that the insider doesn't necessarily have to trade on the information. It's really they impute their insider-ness to the person who is trading by giving them this information. So if I say I'm an insider, I'm the CEO of the company, or I'm a top level official of the company, I know material non-public information, and I tell you about it and you go trade on that, I've imputed my insiderness to you, and you therefore become an insider as a result of that.
I was an insider trader, though, even though, let's say hypothetically, I didn't know that it was material non-public. Would I be in trouble?
Well, that's the thing is that you should, even if you don't know, if it's proven that you should have known that this is material and non-public information, then you would be an insider. Now, here's an interesting bit: is in 1980 there was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Chiarella versus the United States, where a printer figured out from the printing of documents who the firms were in a merger that was about to happen, a takeover that was going to happen. And he traded on this information and was caught. And therefore, they said insider trading. The Supreme Court ruled he was not an insider because he did not receive the information from someone who had fiduciary responsibility and therefore imputed the insider-ness to him. And so it was a 6-3 decision in March of 1980. So that was interesting.
That's fascinating. So, because I would think, you know, without knowing that he would be in trouble, but apparently not so. Now, moving on to our next bananas sports story. The UK's Sunday Times alleges that Qatar's 2022 World Cup organizers paid a total of $5 million to FIFA officials in order to get the World Cup. Now, Qatar's organizers deny such charges. But Ed, hosting the World Cup, it's a huge honor, obviously. So how does a host country selection process work, or how is it supposed to work? That might be the better question.
Yeah. Well, originally, the way it worked, there was sort of an insider agreement that it would be either half in the Americas, half in Europe, and they would switch back and forth over time. And eventually, in 1998, we got Japan and South Korea, who jointly hosted it in Asia. And the way that it works now, basically, is a bunch of different companies come up with bids, and the FIFA managing organization, they vote on who of those bids is going to get the deal. And potentially those voters can be bought off. Right. And I think this is what we're seeing in Qatar, is that people think that some of the people who were making the votes were actually getting bribes.
Right, and that's scary stuff. But I want to play a quick clip from our interview with sports economist Victor Matheson. Check this out.
The Salt Lake City case, we did in fact find that Salt Lake City had a marked increase in the employment during 2002. That employment dissipated after a year. And we found that, in fact, the Olympics created about 7,000 jobs. And that's great. Unfortunately, the Winter Olympic Committee in Salt Lake City had predicted it was going to produce 35,000 new jobs. So what we found was a positive effect of the Olympics, but about 1/5 of what the organizers claimed. And we see that.
Now, Matheson suggests that there are economic benefits for hosting mega sporting events, but that they're only a fraction of what sports organizers claim. So, of course, there are some pretty clear reasons why you'd want to host some games in your city, but does it make it a lot of economic sense to do such a thing? Basically, is there a net gain in this model of moving the World Cup from city to city every 4 years? What do you think?
It's really about the politics more than anything else. You know, it's like, it's one of the reasons that at the UN they have all these round tables. There are no edges. I'm not sitting at the head of the table. You're not sitting at the head of the table.
That's
right?
the reason for round tables.
So basically, they are politicking. You're going to get this event, and it's going to be a big thing. It's going to put you on the map. I mean, that's exactly what we saw in South Korea and Japan, right?
There you have it.
I mean, so that's what it's all about.
Fascinating. I love it, Ed. We got to talk about this more. Lots of sports news coming up this summer, and we'll be covering it all, or at least we'll try to. That's all for now, but you can see all segments featured in today's show on YouTube at youtube.com/BoomBustRT. We also love hearing from you, so please check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/BoomBustRT. Please tweet at us at AaronAid, at EdwardNH. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.